Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'll be sharing how I created this double interactive space theme card. Using my favorite things Out of This World stamp set and one of their interactive die sets for the slider channel, I'll be creating this space theme card. I picked out a pre-done background. I chose one that was done with alcohol inks. And what you see me doing here is preparing the numbers that I'm going to be using for the slider channel portion of the card. These were die cut from Concord and Ninth, the double cut number set. You could stamp the numbers instead of die cutting them like I did here, but it's all up to you how you would like to do your own card. And what I'll do is create a window at the top right hand side, and I'm going to have a slider channel behind that window, so it'll have a countdown from 5 to 1 whenever the slider is pulled up, which you'll see at the very end. So what I'm doing is preparing for the spacing of the slider channel, and I'm using a T ruler so I can make sure that the slider is long enough to fit all the numbers in it. So I'm drawing around the next to smallest square in one of my favorite things, Die-namics STAX sets. And that way I can make sure that I have a long enough piece here. So I've just drawn a line down one side, and I'm measuring about 1/4 inch down, which is what I found the size of that square die is. So I'm just marking off those points, and I'm going to put the numbers in there just to see if that actually works for my card. And I went ahead and drew another guideline on the opposite side just so I could just check for the spacing part. Later I will either be erasing or flipping that piece of paper over, and the pencil marks will not be visible in the final project. Now here I am just spacing out the numbers just so I can check to see what kind of spacing I need for to finish the card. I didn't have a plan at first what the overall finished size would be, and my background there started off at 5 by 7, and as it turned out my finished card ended up being 5 by 7. I ended up trimming the background a little bit and then framing it, which you'll see at the end of the video as far as how I did that framing. Now I also wanted to use the slider channel die, but as you can see it really isn't long enough for the intended size, so I had to be a little bit creative to get this to work. I really wanted that curved top for the slider channel, and I decided to fix it by using a partial die cutting technique. So I'm not going to leave that end out from under the plate so that that part doesn't get cut. So it's just going to cut all the way up to the point to where that plate stops on the top side. And all I really need to do at this point is just trim off the edges just to make a straight edge on each side, and then I can figure out the final sizing from that point. It was just a lot easier to cut off those ends as you saw me do so that I could line it up in my paper trimmer and trim off the edges to align with the already die cut edges. And once I do cut off the sides, I will trim down the overall length based on what I think I'm going to need. Eventually I do have to trim it down a little bit more to fit the channel, but it's really a lot better to have something a little bit too long and then come back and trim it off, because it's really harder to go the other way around and add something to the length later. And after I trimmed off that end piece, I pulled the background out to figure out how much I needed to trim it down before I started putting everything together. Like I said, this started out as 5 by 7 because that's the size of a typical piece of Yupo paper, which is what I created the background on. So I had to think about it a bit before I decided how much to trim off. I ended up going with about 1/4 or a little bit more of an inch at each end, because I knew that I wanted the final size to be 5 by 7, and I knew that I planned to do a double matte frame. So I didn't want to trim off too much because I thought I could always go back and remove more if I really needed to. So I wanted to keep the trimming to a minimum. So now that I have my slider channel piece ready, I'm going to die cut out the window And here I'm trying to decide exactly where the placement of my sentiment will be relative to the window. And now that I have that figured out, I'm going to use a piece of micropore tape and I'll run that through the die cut machine off camera. And once I come back, you'll see my little window there at the top. And when the slider channel is all put together and I pull it up, it's going to do the countdown for the card. So pretty cute, huh? And now that that's ready, I'm going to start preparing that channel. And this is the other part of that die set that helps put that together. Again, like the other die cut piece, it's not quite as long as I really need it to be, but you'll see how I adapt it to make it work with my card. At this point, I'd cut out that die a couple of times and ended up going back later and cutting it a third time to make that overall thickness 3 separate pieces of paper. Right now you're only seeing 2 of them, but in the end I actually add a third part that I did off camera. And there's the little slider piece and how it'll fit into the channel. And I will trim off those top 2 pieces peeking out over the edge, and I actually end up using them later. So this is a good time to mention that sometimes you should not be too quick to throw out little scraps like that, because you may actually need them to finish a project. So I will end up using them to create a stop for the slider so it doesn't come completely out when it's pulled. And you'll see how that works in just a moment. And now I'm going to begin the process of gluing down the numbers. And normally this is not something I would just leave on camera. However, this was a little bit fiddly to do, and why at the beginning I said you may want to use a different method if you decide to replicate this card, such as stamping numbers on, which would certainly be a lot faster than what I did. However, I don't have stamps for numbers, and these dies just happen to be the perfect size for my project, so I just went ahead and did that in this case. So what I will tell you about doing die cuts like this is the spacing is really important, and these were definitely a bit fiddly to get in just the right position. And once I did get them in the right position, I wanted to be able to adhere them all at the same time, except for the 5, which is already glued down. I had a little bit of trouble, as you can see, when I picked up my post-it tape, that the number 4 kind of came apart, so I had to start over and fiddle with these little pieces again and align them up on my tab, and then stick down the post-it tape again, pick them up, and then add the adhesive. This video does not include any coloring techniques. I wanted to make the video more focused on the process of putting the interactive card together. There are quite a few videos out there on creating an alcohol ink background, and what I did with this one is pour some different inks and purples and blues, and then I used also the silver mixative and used a straw to blow the inks around until I liked the way that they looked, and then I allowed them to dry. After the alcohol ink had dried, I decided to add some white stars. I used some white gesso that was watered down a bit, and I used a paintbrush to splatter the gesso onto the background, and then I allowed that to dry overnight just to be really sure that I wouldn't have any smears on the background before doing the rest of the card. And I also pre-stamped and pre-colored all the images from the stamp set before beginning this, so that I could concentrate the majority of the video on just showing how to put the card together. And as I said earlier, die cuts can be a little bit fiddly, and I had a bit of trouble with them during this, but it ended up really being super cute. And now you can see how that countdown is going to work through that window as the pull tab is brought up. So now I'm creating the stop thing, because I can't think of what else you would call it, at the bottom. I need 2 pieces for this. I'm going to add And this is one of the trimmed off pieces from the top from earlier. And then I create another place so that on the inside of the channel, you see where I'm gluing right now is where that piece that's on the actual pull tab will come up against that, and it will stop it from coming out. And it'll be easier to see how that works once it is adhered down to some cardstock. And I'm just kind of holding a piece of cardstock behind it just to see if it's going to slide smoothly. And for the most part it does. If I had stamped the numbers, I probably wouldn't have had that difficulty. Anyhow, moving on to the sentiment, which I'm using just a piece of black cardstock that I had sitting around in my desk. I'm lining up the sentiment that's going on the outside, and I used some anti-static powder first, added some VersaMark, and then some detail white embossing powder. And now I'm heat setting that, and we'll trim that piece up so that I can pop that up on the front of the finished card. And I will be finishing the inside of this card as well. But before I get there, now I'm going back to the back of the front panel, which I had to add some extra pieces of paper, cardstock, to make sure that the level is the same across the entire front of the card. And now I'm going to put the channel back into place. I'm going to add adhesive to the channel pieces there on the left and add some adhesive on the right, and then glue down that panel and check again to make sure that the slider is still working, which it is. And off to the left you see my 5x7 card base in black cardstock. And now I'm going to start adding finishing touches to complete this. I decided to make this a double interactive card by adding a couple of the, I can't think of what these things are called. The little, well, anyway, they'll be in the description below. Wobblers, that's what they are. Anyway, I put a couple of little wobblers on the planet up at the top and the little space alien at the bottom. And I end up deciding I wanted to pop up that sentiment. And I looked around and found just the perfect thing for this. I have these little adhesive dots, and they're actually black foam instead of white. So to me that was more appealing since I had a black strip that I was putting my sentiment on. And the nice thing about these little dots is the background, as you can see, is a dot pattern. And once I remove that top piece, it shows, or the adhesive is exposed, and then you can glue it down, which is exactly what I'm doing right here. And now that that part is finished, I'm going to finish up the inside of the card. So there's a second sentiment from the same stamp set that I used on the inside. And I believe it says, "Hope your birthday is out of this world," or something to that effect. Anyway, I am also using the same detail white embossing powder and tapping off the excess. And bring my heat tool over to heat set it. And I didn't heat my tool quite long enough, so it took me a little bit longer than normal, and it warped my paper a little bit, but after a little bit it actually straightened out and looked just fine. I'm now gluing down some additional stamped and colored images I had done for the inside of the card. I'm going to add some liquid adhesive to the back, being careful not to glue down the pull tab for the front. I'll adhere that down to my card base, adjust it to make sure that it's in the right position, and now I have my countdown piece, and there's the finished card. I so appreciate you checking out my video today, and I hope you liked it. If you did, please consider leaving me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, I hope you will. Thank you again. Bye.